Yes, yes, ma'am. In 2-3 minutes we will start. We will wait for the participants, and we will be having this session live on Facebook.
Okay, that's great.
Widely now because of this pandemic. Is it being used a lot
Quite
now?
often. Quite often.
Yes, all of my classes this
Yeah.
year will be on Zoom.
Okay. Although it's not our official platform. This is
Nobody's official, yeah.
Not official, but we are using it quite often because I think this is very user friendly. This one.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Otherwise, there are so many platforms like WebEx,
Right.
Google Meet, etc. So whichever is available, we are trying to use that.
Yeah.
You have placed a very nice photograph of hills surrounded by clouds.
Yes,
What is that?
this is actually my view from my house above Uttarakhand. I have a house above Uttarakhand and view during the monsoon.
Okay, when was it?
I might have taken this 1 year ago, last year, the year before, like that.
Okay, you were on Fulbright grant? You were on Fulbright grant?
Yes, I was on a Fulbright. I come to Garhwal every year.
Every year.
And except this year, of course, when it is impossible to travel.
So
and,
then you are virtually here.
Yes. I claim that I'm an Uttarakhandi.
Yeah. Right in the heart of Uttarakhand, that is Srinagar.
Yeah, that's right. In Srinagar, is absolutely in the heart. Srinagar should be the capital city of the state.
But unfortunately, it is not.
That's right. That's right. Because it is easier of access than Dehradun to the rest of the district.
Yes. And I think Professor Purohit is coordinating from Shimla.
Oh, he's in Shimla now.
I think so. He's in Shimla. I don't know, where is the Professor Purohit?
He seems to.
He was there. I can't see him now.
No, my guess is that he's having reception problems and that he's coming in and out.
Okay, maybe connectivity problems.
Yeah, probably, because I know he would be here if he did not have. He
No,
was on a minute.
And you are very well versed with the area, so you know how the connectivity goes and comes.
I do. I'm very well versed.
Right. So how are things in your place?
Well, it's very quiet. I'm right now in my native place, 2,000 kilometers from where I live.
Okay.
But my native place is a hill station of about 2,200 meters. And in the state of New Mexico, a place called Santa Fe, which is a very, very old city in the southwest.
Okay.
And it's a very beautiful place. And it's a wonderful time to be out here. I had to drive the 2,000 kilometers in my car to get here. And
long drive indeed.
Yes, but it's good, fast roads. It took only about 18 hours to drive. Not terrible. I will go back next week and begin my classes on Zoom.
On Zoom. So your all classes are online this year, this semester?
No, all my classes are, but there are many classes that must meet in person.
Okay, in person. Yeah, here we have also decided to go online. We are preferring that we should take online classes. So they are also about to start.
During their studies and with everybody isolated, there will be many fewer students, probably 15% fewer students this year. Many of them will just not take classes this year, but hopefully next year.
So it has affected education sector quite differently. Right?
Very badly, very badly. American education system is really under enormous financial stress right now because of this. And I don't see this changing for at least another year. Hopefully by next year, everything will be
we hope so, because in the morning there was a news that the Russians, they have developed the vaccine Sputnik.
Yeah, I read about that, but they haven't really tested very much. And there was one Indian doctor I was talking to last week who said that the vaccine will be maybe 35% effective at the most.
Okay.
So,
but the Russian president was claiming that this vaccine has been applied on his 2 daughters also. So I don't know.
Yeah, let's see what happens.
And there is a hope.
Right, right. Yeah.
Unless the vaccine is there, only then.
Yeah, I hope that they've uncovered it.
Okay.
But even if the Russian government announces this, most doctors will say, well, let's just see. Let's wait until we... There's no doctor who's going to say that this is completely effective without even knowing about it. But maybe it will work. Let's hope.
No one can say it can give a ray of hope, or it can adverse the situation. Nobody knows.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Frederick. Hello.
Shall we start the session?
I think so. You should start it, because I think how many participants are you expecting to join?
Participants, ma'am, actually, we expect that most of the participants will join through Facebook.
Okay, so then let it go. They will join through Facebook. It's not necessary for them to join this platform. They can go to Facebook.
Yes. Right now we are live. Right now we are live on Facebook, and I request Naresh to start.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Annapurna Nautiyal, our today's speaker Professor Frederick M. Smith, Professor D.R. Purohit, and respected dignitaries in the audience, and dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dr. Naresh Kumar. It gives me immense pleasure in welcoming all of you to this special lecture. This is the part of lecture series organized by HNV Garhwal University to celebrate 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. Today we have with us very eminent scholar, Professor Frederick M. Smith, who will deliver his lecture on representation of Gandhi in India and the West. An open discussion will follow the lecture, and respected Professor D.R. Purohit will moderate the discussion. I request you all to type your question in chat box. Before moving forward, I would like to request Honorable Vice Chancellor to enlighten us with her address. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Naresh. The key speaker of this session, Professor Frederick Smith, Professor of Sanskrit and Classical Indian Religions, University of Iowa, U.S.A. And the moderator of the session, Professor D.R. Purohit, who is a dear colleague and who has facilitated this talk with Professor Frederick Smith, and all the faculty members, all the participants, and all the other senior faculty members. On behalf of the HNB Garhwal University, I extend a very warm welcome to everyone. The coordinators of this workshop, Dr. Prashant Kandari, Dr. Naresh Kumar, Dr. Nagendra Rawat, Dr. Rakesh Negi, Dr. Shweta Verma, and all others who have provided all the necessary help to coordinate and to organize this lecture. I welcome them also, and also thank them to be helpful in organizing this online lecture. As I would like to just briefly inform you that the Government of India has decided to celebrate the 150th birth anniversary of our father of nation, Mahatma Gandhi. And therefore, it was decided that there would be 150 lectures in 150 institutions by eminent scholars and speakers to celebrate the birthday of this great man. So that's how the HNB Garhwal University has also been given this opportunity to organize the lectures, special invited lectures, and also to organize webinars and symposia on Gandhian ideologies, ideas, which is relevant in the present context also. So just briefly, I would also like to tell you that generally we are trying to organize this lecture in association with foreign university. Why? Because the purpose is that the Gandhian philosophy should go to the foreign universities also, and to students of their universities, so that they can understand what is Gandhian philosophy, what is Gandhian idea. So we started it with the University of Haifa, Israel. We have a MOU with that university, and Professor Eric Moran gave the first lecture that was also related to the traditional culture of Himachal Pradesh, and he related it to the Gandhian philosophy of Swadeshi self-reliance. Then the next lecture which we organized, it was not a lecture actually, it was a webinar, and it was we invited our neighboring countries like Nepal, which we have some problems, Bangladesh again. So we tried to involve the neighboring countries, because we face the same kind of problems of poverty, of underdevelopment, and of the people's problem. So it was a very good webinar that way, because it was focused on the Gandhian idea of rural development. Because Gandhiji used to say that the soul of India lives in the villages. If the villages are rich, they are self-reliant, they are prosperous, India can be rich and self-reliant and prosperous. So the rural development was main idea behind this webinar. And today's lecture, which Professor Frederick Smith will give, is also very, very important, because it will provide a representation of Gandhi in India and West. And I think it will be a very learning experience for all the participants, all the scholars, and all the faculty members, that how he relates Gandhi in India and West. As I was informally talking with Professor Smith, so I found that he is a keen watcher of India, because he has been coming to India very frequently, and he told me that every year he comes to India. And I am very sure that he has a very deep eye about not only seeing the urban areas, but also rural areas of India, and then relate it with the Western conditions. So that way I can say that this lecture would be very, very interesting, and all of us are looking forward towards this lecture. I would also like to add a few things, that the Gandhian ideas, particularly of self-reliance, to which our Honorable Prime Minister has given a call, that we should be vocal for local. And this is very important under the present pandemic conditions, because self-reliance is the motto. To encounter the problems which we are facing in everyday life. And if we adopt Swadeshi is very helpful to give, to provide opportunities of income generation to the local people, to the rural people, and the people who have migrated again to their native villages from the urban areas because of this COVID pandemic. So I think this is a very important idea, that we develop some kind of techniques, some kind of training, or some kind of skill mapping of those migrants, so that they can settle down in their villages and earn their living there only. So the concept of earning from their own villages will provide the self-reliant mode of living to them also. And then, as Gandhiji always believed in Swachhata, means he always wanted to have a clean and neat atmosphere. And this Swachhata has become the benchmark of this pandemic in the present times. Because every day we are preaching or we are practicing that we should have a hygienic atmosphere. And as Professor Smith is, I think he has been, since he has been visiting India so many times, so he must have seen that there is lots of filth and unhygienic conditions in India. So for India, this is an opportunity to be neat and clean, and to also improve the atmosphere which is prevailing around us. So the key to this pandemic is the hygiene, particularly of the hygiene of health, that you have to keep your hands clean, you have to wash your hands, and also use sanitizers if you don't have any means to clean your hands. And then mask has also become very important under these conditions. And although Mahatma Gandhi preached Swachhata, and he also worked a lot for this. So presently also throughout the world, this message has gone that unless we improve our habits and we improve our livelihood, we are not going to survive. This has been told us during this pandemic, because the nature has improved a lot during this pandemic, because our exploitative habits, they damage the nature so much. And the beautiful picture which I am seeing behind Professor Smith reminds me of this clean nature, which was not visible in Delhi and all the metropolitan cities because of the pollution, the highest level of pollution. The air was highly unhealthy, unbreathable. But this air now has become less polluted because of the lockdowns which were imposed on India time to time. So talking again about Mahatma Gandhi, because the main speaker is Professor Frederick Smith. So I'll not take much time, but I would just like to say that the concept of Satya, Ahimsa, Satyagraha, Swadeshi, Swachhata, and the movements which Mahatma Gandhi launched peacefully for various causes, they were marvelous. And I think these movements we still need for many things, and these movements should be very peaceful when the whole world is becoming a kind of distant world, because we can see one another virtually, but now it has become very difficult to, like if I want to go to the US, I would not be interested to go because of this corona pandemic. Same is with other people also. Everyone has become fearful of the others. So we are naturally adopting the social distancing, which was otherwise not a normal norm. And this has created many problems in the society. It is creating some kind of various kind of distances, and this is affecting the society in economic field, social field, environmental field. And as I was talking to Professor Smith, that education field has been affected too much by corona. And like we are organizing this lecture online, so the teaching will also be online. So there are many lessons which are learned through this COVID situation. And this COVID or this pandemic is unparalleled in the recent history. One pandemic happened in 1918. After that, this is the one of the prominent pandemic uh, for which till now there is no medicine and nothing has been developed. So again, coming back to Gandhi, Gandhi always said that you have to live. If you have to live, then you should let others also live. He always believed in the theory of live and let live. So he said that there is enough for everyone in this earth, but we should not be greedy. We should not snatch or we should not exploit others' portions. So because of our these habits, because of our greed, increasing greed for acquiring things, we are suffering due to lots of problems, lots of things are happening. So the live and let live is not a concept which we should adopt, because this is the key to survival now. Because now it's not the survival of the fittest, but now it is the survival of humankind. Because the mightest is also affecting by corona. Any corona can hit anyone, it has been seen. So the concept of live and let live is most prominent, and I think it is key to peace also, key to survival also, and key to prosperity and a healthy and peaceful life also. And in this context, I would like to say my heartfelt thanks to Professor D.R. Purohit. And you can see that he is putting on a sweater, pullover, because he's sitting in Shimla and enjoying the cool weather. And we are sitting in Srinagar, where it's very hot and humid. And Professor Smith is also enjoying the mountains. We are also in the mountains, but these mountains are of different type, because they become very hot and humid during these months of July and August and September. So this heat becomes very unbearable. So I'm jealous of both of you that you are sitting in cool climates, and we are sitting in the AC also, but still it's very hot and humid. So anyways, with these remarks, I would like to once again extend a very warm welcome to Professor Smith, that despite the distance of time and place, and it's a very odd time for anyone to be asked to give a lecture. So he has been very generous to give his time and to be with us for this session. And I'm looking forward towards his lecture. And Professor Purohit, I'm always thankful to Professor Purohit. And as you must be knowing Professor Smith, that he was in the Department of English here, but he is also working on the classical Indian traditions. And he also established a department of and folk art, and he's a master of all the folk culture. And you can ask him anything, and he would be able to narrate the same story to you in the same spirit. So this is his capability, and this is his quality. And I think you were connected to him because of this connection only, because he is also working on the classical Indian traditions, and you are also working on the classical Indian traditions. So I extend a welcome to both of you, and I thank you both of you for giving this opportunity to this audience to share or to listen to your views, and then afterwards share their opinion also through Q&A. So from on behalf of HND Garhwal University, I welcome each one of the participants and the key speaker, Professor Smith, and the moderator, Professor Purohit, and all the dignitaries, all the scholars, all the professors, all the senior faculty members, and the coordinator of this team. Thank you very much. Welcome once again. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I also like to thank our participants from Bangladesh. Now I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor Frederick M. Smith.
Sure.
Professor Smith is a professor of Sanskrit and Classical English, Indian Languages, Department of Religious Studies and Asian and Slavic Languages and Literature, University of Iowa. He received his PhD from University of Pennsylvania in 1984. His work includes studies of texts and performances of Vedic sacrifice ritual from antiquity to present. Study of religious experiences in India with primary focus on history and phenomenology of deity and spirit possession. The writing of Vallabhacharya, the founder of sect of Krishna devotion in early 16th century and his successor, and India's great epic Mahabharata. He is currently completing a book-length translation of last 5 parva of Mahabharata. He teaches all level of Sanskrit, Indian and South Asian religion, comparative religion and ritual studies. He studied in India for 17 years and has traveled widely in Tibet and China. He has written many books, most notably The Self-Possessed Deities and Spirit Possession in South Asian Literature and Civilization, Columbia University. He has published many articles in scholarly peer-reviewed journals. So without wasting any time, I invite Professor Frederick M. Smith to deliver his special lecture.
1 minute, Naresh. I would just like to say, आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है, अभिनंदन है और आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद है कि आपने गढ़वाल यूनिवर्सिटी में अपना भाषण देने की स्वीकृति दी है. तो इसके लिए आपका बहुत बहुत अभिनंदन, आभार और बहुत बहुत स्वागत. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you today. I cannot express how happy I am to be with you all. I'm honored to be here under the auspices of Professor Annapurna Nautiyal, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of HNB Garhwal University, and to have been asked to address you at this time of worldwide turmoil on the topic of the father of independent India, Mahatma Gandhi. And I've been pleased to be asked by Dr. Prashant Kandari and my dear friend and mentor in all things Himalaya, Dr. D.R. Purohit, whose contributions to Indian and Garhwali culture are unsurpassed in his generation. I'm also pleased to learn just now that Dr. Arik Moran from Haifa has addressed you, because I know him and he's a fine person and a wonderful young scholar. I also appreciate that your Prime Minister, Shri Modi, has advocated vocal for local in this difficult time of pandemic. It's a very nice term and aspiration. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, acknowledged as a Mahatma or great soul by all, even reluctantly by his detractors. So thanks go out to Dr. Purohit and Kandari, as well as to those of you who are joining me on this Zoom talk, as well as on Facebook, which I've just learned. Indeed, Zoom has become the default medium for lakhs, even crores of scholars and students all over the world, including at my own university in Iowa, where most of our classes will be on Zoom rather than in class this year. And I suspect this is going to presage major changes in our whole educational system for forever. And I'll just say that I'll be able to follow some of your comments if you place them on Zoom, but I cannot follow Facebook, Zoom, and my talk all at the same time. And if for some reason you do not hear me, if my reception goes off, please make a comment on Zoom just to let me know so that something can be rectified on this. Okay. Mahatma Gandhi was a compulsive writer. His written output came to approximately 50,000 pages, published in about 100 volumes. It would not be an exaggeration to say that at least one article or book has been published on Gandhi for every page he wrote. Tens of thousands, perhaps indeed 50,000 books and articles on Gandhi have been written in the last century and more, covering every aspect of his life and thought, his exploits, his successes and failures, his economic proposals, analyses of his psychology. Authorities disagree wildly on this. His intentions and motives, his marital and sex life, such as it was, his growth as a leader in South Africa and then in India, his influence throughout the world, his enduring appeal and the venom continuously spewed against him, his relevance and irrelevance, his views on the Bhagavad Gita, the origins of his doctrines of nonviolence and swachhata, and so on, his agility with a charka, his environmental programs, his strength and the force of his personality, with the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, and the recent accusations of racism leveled against him for his views in South Africa in the 1890s and his later views on race, including his enormous influence on Martin Luther King Jr. and in the United States and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And there's been a lot written about his final fast and assassination and much more. Just the list of what's been written about him, as you can see, is extensive, and I could have gone on for a lot longer. It has often been said that he has been written about more than any person in history, and in nearly every bibliographers using advanced computing and bibliographical access to hundreds of languages. What then can I say or add to the discussion, especially after Professor Nautial's words of wisdom a few minutes ago? I'm primarily, as was mentioned, I'm primarily a scholar of Sanskrit and Indian religion and history. I'm not a Gandhi specialist into his own writing and have tried to keep up with at least some of from the detailed historical perspective that you can find in many straight biographical works. With this as a prelude and a caveat, I would like to address a few representations of Gandhiji's life and work, particularly from an international focus. So I have three areas in which I need to divide up my talk here. One, Gandhi's nonviolence and satyagraha. Two, his environmental ideas, particularly relevant today in swachhata, as Professor Nautial has noted. And three, his role as a public intellectual, especially as a moral exemplar or ideal in his quest for social reform. It must be noted that these three are not mutually exclusive. They relate to each other as parts of a whole. As such, I have diverged a bit from the original title of this talk, which might lead you to believe that I have about a whole list of snapshots, but instead I've divided it into these three areas of representation. So I would like to highlight Gandhian influence in the US, and look at his life and work in terms of what I regard as a very important and little known academic book. So part one here on nonviolence. For Gandhiji, nonviolence was not simply the absence of physical violence. Self-rule and radical democracy in which everyone participates in the governance process were also part of Gandhiji's idea of nonviolence. He believed that self-rule, Swadeshi, should extend to all people, rich and poor, male and female, at all levels of society. To him, authority over others was a form of violence. To achieve that vision, he encouraged participation of women and the lower castes in economic and political matters. It's easy to see that those in positions of power would adopt strategies opposed to this to gain and retain power. This is why majoritarian rule far too often perpetuates violence towards minorities. I'll use this word majoritarian several times, which indicates the rule and the power of majorities to suppress minorities. And this is found throughout the world, including in the US and in India. Let me spend a couple of minutes now discussing a book by the well-known anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, who was born into a Tamil family in Mumbai, but was educated at the University of Chicago and has taught at many of the top-rated universities in the US. I have known Arjun Appadurai for maybe more than 40 years. Because he was a young professor when I first began graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania. He has a book published in 2006 called Fear of Small Numbers, which I regard as an important book. It's a small book but of this book is a counterintuitive thesis. Fear of and anger towards minorities is inversely proportional to their size. The smaller the number, the deeper the rage, he says. Minority groups serve as visible reminders of a nation's incompleteness, that's his word, and smaller minorities seen as undeserving of the recognition they have achieved only attract more resentment. However, around this picture of majority-minority competition, Appadurai assembles a series of more complex claims, which will be, as we'll see, very relevant to Gandhiji and the current legacy of Gandhi in India. First, the anxiety of incompleteness, that's Appadurai's term, is exacerbated or made worse by processes associated with globalization. What majority groups fear is losing their status as a majority. This is very evident in the US among whites and in India among certain sectors of Hindus. Appadurai writes that globalization intensifies this volatility by eroding settled connections between identity and territory, which is to say that identity is expressed in terms of territory. In other words, this is my place, this is my territory, not yours, including in the US, where some people regard it as a white territory, which of course is untrue, and India as a Hindu territory, especially Hinduism as defined today by a certain minority sector of Brahminical thought and ritual. Second, Appadurai argues that fears of lost identity must be understood as symptoms of a historical transformation from a world of rule-bound, centralized nation states to a world of decentralized, non-state actors, which is to say of various more or less powerless ethnic or religious groups functioning within the larger state. This could be African Americans in the US or Muslims, Sikhs, and Jains in India. The US has little concern for its remaining Native American population, its Adivasis, because most of them were exterminated in the 19th century. And the remaining Native Americans are largely impoverished and completely lack political power. Similarly, India has little concern for its Adivasis because they are a tiny percentage of the population and are mostly non-threatening An exception is the Bodo in the far northeast. But a significant percentage of white American voters, fortunately not a majority, exemplified by the current president, turn a blind eye towards state violence directed at African Americans, neglectful of the fact that their plight was born of one of the most brutal forms of slavery in recorded history. Similarly, Indian state violence towards its principal non-Adivasi minority, namely Muslims, supported by much of the state apparatus, is neglectful of the fact that these people are descended from groups that entered India perhaps 15 or 20 generations ago and are by now fully Indian. Faced with this decentralization of political authority, majority groups, once confident of their dominance, feel increasingly anxious and fearful. And indeed, terrorist organizations, one unfortunate example of the agency of these oppressed minorities, capitalize on this anxiety, increasing the levels of fear and diminishing the possibility of effective nonviolence. Gandhiji's strategy would have been to understand the intentions and modalities of the oppressing majority, which would enable the minority to cut short such encounters and engage productively with the majority or the oppressor. Gandhiji had no fear of takeovers of majorities by minorities. In fact, history bears out that this virtually never occurs. The major exception is the takeover of a heavily populated Western Hemisphere by small numbers of Europeans in the 16th century, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. A virtue of Appadurai's book is its original account of the social psychology of ethnic conflict. His title suggests an emphasis on core emotions, such as fear and anger. Indeed, he offers compelling accounts of these. However, much of his analysis concerns secondary emotions, such as uncertainty, anxiety, and frustration. Whereas fear and anger within a majority community possess identifiable objects, they are responses to an allegedly ascendant minority group that threatens the legitimacy or power of the majority. Uncertainty, anxiety, and frustration are less determinate. Uncertainty, for example, possesses a special capacity to integrate memories, prejudices, and grievances from various aspects of social life. Such a dynamic is at play, Appadurai suggests, when a majority group uses a minority as a scapegoat for social problems. This is exactly the way majorities in the US and India treat their minorities, as well as this also occurs, we know, in China, Burma, Brazil, Australia, England, and dozens of other countries. With respect to the current global phenomenon of ethnic nationalism, spreading like a virus from country to country, which is, of course, another kind of globalization, we can argue that part of this transfer of ethnic nationalism is an export and exchange of fear and uncertainty, a global perpetuation of distrust between minority and majority groups. It is largely politically driven by parties that feel they have something to gain through hardening divisiveness, rather than encouraging resolution, accommodation, and unification. 21st century Hindutva, for example, to quote Appadurai, was enriched by the infusion of language taken from the global war on terror as a distant event that was integrated into local movements, thirsty for evidence that might support claims about Muslims as a threatening minority. It occurs to me that Gandhiji, in spite of his extreme tendencies to stay away from modern equipment and his populism in the form of long walks with ordinary people and his strict personal dress code of self-spun dhoti and chappals he would make, would recognize all of this within the orbit of our world of instant communication and easy travel, which was possible at least until about 6 months ago. And I would be in India now if this world of easy travel were still with us. And I would be speaking from where you are viewing me, which is the valley below my house near Uttarakhand during the monsoon, a photograph I took a year or two ago at this time. Apadurais' central thesis on the fear of small numbers assimilates diverse processes into a tidy picture of majority-minority competition. At any given time, a majority exists as a coherent and well-defined entity whose fears and insecurities are transparent to its members. Minority groups are equally recognizable. However, precisely because he appreciates the flexibility of social categories and the susceptibility of groups to uncertainty, fear of small numbers ends up suggesting that, for example, Hindu fundamentalists must consistently work to sustain a Hindu identity when the members of that group are in fact divided according to caste, community, a sect, deity affiliation, region, and even within states. I lived in Maharashtra for about 8 years, and the local religiosity of people from villages of Khandesh or Jalgaon district or Pune or Mumbai, Kolhapur, all of these different places that I knew well. And so to consider it as one single entity would be to take up the Western idea that Hinduism is one thing that was perpetuated by the British. Whereas in fact, there's an incredible diversity, which is part of the beauty of India. Gandhiji would certainly agree with this. He celebrated the exceptional diversity of ideas and viewpoints in India. It is talent that India should relearn from Gandhiji today. Ideas about violence and authority circulated in the U.S. in the 19th century, especially among the Christian peace churches such as Quakers and Mennonites. In this view, equality and the lack of hierarchical structures are forms of nonviolence. For Gandhiji, it was Hinduism and Jainism that shaped his activism. His mother, a devout Pushtimargi Hindu, taught him the importance of fasting as a form of self-discipline and religious devotion. From the Jains, with whom he grew up in Saurashtra, he learned ahimsa and aparigraha, non-violence and non-acquisitiveness. In particular, he drew from the Bhagavad Gita for a religious framework on the values of simplicity, duty, and non-violence. Part 2, Gandhi's environmentalism. Was Gandhi the progenitor of environmental ideas in this country? Which means India. I'm putting myself in India. The answer is yes and no. He was an environmentalist if we look closely at the implications of his social, political, and economic ideas on the environment. Many environmental movements in India, and increasingly in the West, have drawn inspiration from Gandhiji. He cannot be called an environmentalist if we do a mechanical analysis of his statements based on the present understanding of environmental issues, since words like environment and ecology do not appear in his collected works. The Encyclopedia of Human Ecology, edited by Julia Miller and others, does not have an entry on Gandhiji in its otherwise impressive list, but the implications of his ideas for an ecologically sound system of living are strong, and no doubt he left an enormous impact on modern environmental thinking. Environmental consciousness is a phenomenon that gained momentum only in the last half century or so after Gandhiji's death, even if it is implicit in worldviews, traditions, culture, religion, and folklore throughout the world. Ecology is a subject that seeks to understand the relationship between living organisms and their environment. Human ecology visualizes human beings and their environment as constituting an integrated whole. The Western tendency to compartmentalize everything into different categories does not agree with the ecological perspective, which is more in tune with Indian and precisely Vedic and Vedantic ideas of linkages, bandhu or bandhuta, of putting things together. Consistent with this, Gandhiji saw interrelations. In his writings, we find elements of economics, politics, and sociology suffused with an interconnectedness informed by ethics. He says, and I quote here, "I believe in Advaita. I believe in the essential unity of man, and for that matter, of all lives." One of his principal disciples, J.C. Kumarappa, Gandhiji's economist, who developed his ecological views in clearer fashion, said, quote, "In the traditional archives of knowledge, religion, sociology, and economy have all been reserved their separate and exclusive spheres. Man has been divided into various watertight compartments. The left hand is not to know what the right hand does. Nature does not recognize such divisions. She deals with life as a whole. This is an often voiced concern about hyper-specialization in all fields, from literary analysis to computer science to microbiology to medicine, where we often see that an expert on the spleen knows nothing about the pancreas, and where experts in one area of modern Indian history will know nothing about other areas of modern Indian history, and so on. And Gandhiji looked at things much more holistically, which is why he always encouraged doctors to look at native plants. A human ecology perspective is thus holistic. Gandhi did not recognize separate rules for separate spheres of human life, but saw all spheres as integrated. The issues currently discussed under the label of environment and environmentalism were not prominent during his lifetime. However, his description of modern industrial civilization as a seven-day wonder contains a prognosis and a warning. Gandhi had anticipated most of the environmental problems that we face today. He envisaged an ecological needs model centered on limitation of wants, in contrast to the modern civilization that promoted material welfare and the profit motive. Gandhi said, quote, "A certain degree of physical harmony and comfort is necessary, but above a certain level, it becomes a hindrance instead of a help. Therefore, the ideal of creating an unlimited number of wants and satisfying them seems to be a delusion and a snare." End of quote. Even if Gandhiji would be stunned by today's hard sell branding and corporate capitalism, many still recognize the truth in Gandhiji's words. According to him, a man who multiplies his daily wants cannot achieve the goal of plain living and high thinking. He warned against the perils of industrialization. He said, quote, "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization after the manner of the West. The economic imperialism of a single tiny island kingdom, England, is today keeping the world in chains. If an entire nation of 300 million took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts." Imagine India with 300 million people. Well, there are now 1 billion more people in India than when Gandhi wrote these words in 1928. And the world is indeed all but stripped bare, as if by a plague of locusts. Jainism influenced Gandhi. Jainism looks at nature as a living entity and exhorts human beings to continue to purify themselves by nature and all life forms with equal reverence, at least in theory, though certainly not in practice. Gandhiji drew on a number of Western thinkers. This project, remember, we're talking about 19th century people here, late 19th century, romantically cherished the pre-industrial order. John Ruskin, for example, was critical of industrialization in that it had sapped human sensibility and destroyed the harmonious relationship humans had with nature. Henry David Thoreau, an American poet and naturalist whose essay on civil disobedience had influenced Gandhi, was very close to nature and wrote eloquently and influentially, influenced by John Ruskin and Hindu mysticism, also led a life that was simple and close to nature. His critique of civilization was a major influence on Gandhiji's Hind Swaraj. Carpenter, a socialist, was also an early animal rights activist. What is special about all these thinkers is a kind of romanticism about nature and a general distaste for industrial civilization and urbanization. We have statements of Gandhi expressing similar romanticism. Bhikhu Parekh, a well-known Gujarati political theorist who now sits in the House of Lords in England as a Labour Party member, says that Gandhiji took exception to the anthropomorphic view that man has unlimited right to lord over the non-human world, and instead proposed a cosmocentric anthropology that, to quote Bhikhu Parekh here, establishes a more balanced and respectful relationship between him and the natural world, assigns animals their due place, and provides the basis of a more satisfactory and ecologically conscious philosophical anthropology, end of quote. In fact, Gandhi's ecological concerns emerged from his focus on a basic needs model of social order that would not exploit nature for short-term gains, but take only from it what is absolutely necessary for human sustenance. Gandhiji had to concede that life involves a certain amount of violence to nature, even if it is unintended. What we can do is minimize it. Gandhiji has been a major influence on a number of Western writers and environmentalists, including one whom I happen to like, named Arne Naess, N-A-E-S-S, founder of something called Deep Ecology, but more formally, he called his brand of environmentalism biospherical egalitarianism, in which the rights and skills of virtually every species are given equal prominence. Anyway, he points out often that he was influenced by Gandhi's academic audience, but his book called Economy of Permanence has been often cited as an example of green thought and sustainable development couched in a Gandhian framework. The very title of the book, Economy of Permanence, is ecologically rooted. He was advocating an economy based on the natural order. He said, quotation here, "In studying human institutions, we should never lose sight of that great teacher, Mother Nature. Anything that we may devise, if it is contrary to her ways, will ruthlessly annihilate sooner or later. Everything in nature seems to follow a cyclical movement. Water from the sea rises as vapor and falls on land in refreshing showers and returns back again to the sea. A nation that forgets or ignores this fundamental process in forming its institutions will disintegrate. According to Kumarappa, industrialism is possible only through not interfere much in the system ordained with nature. And in many ways, agriculture only aids nature or improves it much faster than what could take place naturally over a long period. Kumarappa was therefore concerned with improving the fertility of the soil through the use of organic manure and processed human for agricultural operations. In this way, Vandana Shiva sits squarely with Kumarappa and Gandhiji. Gandhi said, quote, "The great nature has intended us to learn to earn our bread by the sweat of our brow." He also added, "I venture to suggest that it is the fundamental law of nature, without exception, that nature produces enough for our wants from day to day, and if only everybody took enough for himself and nothing more, there would be no pauperism in this world. There would be no man dying of starvation in this world." We know that Ramachandra Guha has written widely in a book called "How Much Should a Human Consume?" A very, very Gandhian book taken exactly after this viewpoint. So Gandhiji also looked at acquisitiveness as not only wasteful, but immoral. As an ardent advocate of indigenous strong slant towards nature cure, we all know that he spent a very long time in nature cure centers, including a place called Urali Kanchan, very close to Pune, where I lived for 8 years. Gandhiji tried to prod most of the medical practitioners of his age to undertake research on the medicinal properties of local plants. And there are several institutions in which I have visited and participated to some extent in South India that are dedicated to recovering and recording the uses of natural substances, natural plants to add to the whole medicinal catalog that we have today. Gandhiji did not talk much about the abstract notion of earth, but he talked a lot about land and soil. To support the agricultural economy, he also emphasized artisan economy, spinning clothes with a charkha, repairing of agricultural tools, arts and crafts, that made these rural peasant communities free from depending on machine-made and mass-produced industrial goods and tools, and made them, of course, less susceptible to exploitation by major national and international forces. Gandhiji was not fascinated with wilderness and rainforests like today's naturalists. We do not see him visiting places of interest to naturalists, yet he believed that nature should be allowed to take its own course. He even prohibited people from stocking medicines against poisonous bites and talked about the possibility of coexistence with the non-human world. In fact, ecological life was part and parcel of the Gandhian ashram life. Since Gandhi's cottage in Sevagram was not reptile-proof, he often had to pick up snakes with the help of a pair of long tongs that he always kept and release them in places far away from the people. He looked at all life as sacred and all human beings as part of the divine, living in harmony with other beings. The suffering of all living beings was of concern to him. Gandhiji recognized that there was some kind of continuity between lording over nature and lording over other inferior people, as in colonialism. Human beings have to be trustees of the lower animal kingdom, he believed. This notion of stewardship of the earth and all living beings on it is the hallmark of Gandhian ecology. It is opposed by Arnius's deep ecology, which, as I said earlier, advocates a greater kind of equality among beings. But that's not a concern for us here. Conservation was a part of Gandhiji's day-to-day life. He would use water very sparingly. It could be said the same of money and other personal resources. He also found the need to conserve his sexual energy for larger goals. One could dismiss these as eccentricities, as austere practices associated with him in a personal capacity. Since Gandhiji did not try to distinguish between his personal and public life at any point in time, he conveyed the value of conserving resources for future generations. In all these, he personified a true ecologist. His antipathy towards urbanization also reflected an attitude full of implications for the environment. In some ways, his banya thriftiness came in handy as an environmental principle worthy of adoption. Gandhi had a special love for the cow. It epitomized the non-human world, and he saw cow protection as one of the duties of human beings that enables them to relate themselves best with the non-human world. This is because the cow not only provides nourishing milk for the family, but also helps us in agriculture, both for tilling the land as for supplying the necessary manure. Ahimsa for Gandhi envisaged or subsumed an awareness of the interdependency of all life. Ahimsa can emerge only in a disciplined environment in which a person renounces pleasures of the body for higher spiritual pursuit. Vandana Shiva, the ecofeminist environmental activist from Dehradun, as you all know, who acknowledges Gandhian influence on her thinking and work, embarked on programs like Seed Satyagraha to protect biodiversity and seed and prevent it from becoming the monopoly of a handful of multinational corporations. Gandhiji advocated small, local, and village-based technology that allowed its users to relate themselves with what they produce. For him, technological progress was not a sign of real progress. The charkha represented the ideal technological equipment for Gandhiji. A technology that would not replace human labor was what he had in mind. From a Gandhian perspective, the present environmental mess, ranging from deforestation, soil and biodiversity loss, to pollution and climate change, is not a disease, but only a symptom. A good doctor treats the disease and not the symptom. The disease is the very concept and patterns of growth and development that are being followed everywhere, which is to say, the kind of competition that leads to the ascendancy and government sanction of multinational corporations, largely for the benefits of their leaders and stockholders, leaving out the majority of the people. Thus, we can say that Gandhi's environmentalism fitted in with his overall vision of India and the world that sought to extract from nature what is absolutely necessary for human sustenance. His ideas on the environment are intimately linked with his ideas relating to polity, economy, health, and development. Is asceticism and simple living, rural-centered handicraft, crafts and craft-centered education, emphasis on manual labor, and absence of exploitative relationships are infused with elements of an ecological vision. It is therefore no wonder that Gandhiji is a major inspiration for many environmental movements worldwide, particularly for those who link their movements with larger concerns for human sustenance and development. He would not be an inspiration for radical environmentalists who allow little space for human sustenance and livelihood issues. Although he was not anthropocentric in his views, in his approach, he was not prepared to allow the question of human survival to be sidelined in discussions on the environment. Part 3, Gandhi as a writer and as a public personality. Gandhiji was one of the leading public intellectuals of the 20th century. A public intellectual is usually described as a writer or scholar who has a public presence. Well-known examples in India today are Ramachandra Guha and Shashi Tharoor. Ambedkar and Einstein were other famous public intellectuals. Due to Gandhiji's exceptional literary output, one can posit that he spent every minute of every hour writing. But he did a lot more than that, of course, in a lifetime of meeting people, interviews, speaking engagement, and spending long hours walking and at his charka. In spite of his well-known abstemiousness and celibacy, he lived a much more integrated life than most intellectuals today, who sit at their desks all day, order or pick up food from outside the house, watch TV during their downtime, and never exercise. Would Gandhiji take to Twitter or host a blog today? Probably he would have a blog if he could get over his hang-up about technology. But Twitter, maybe not. He would not have wanted to host his ideas in the most oversimplified manner possible. Usually, public intellectuals advocate one or another form of modernism. Gandhiji both did and did not. He wrote creatively on nonviolence in a modern way, and his actions well reflected his words. However, he was distinctly anti-modern. His ideology countered the project of modernity. Despite the powerful counter-ideology held by Gandhi and his followers, that India's destiny rested on traditional knowledge and indigenous technologies, the modernizers prevailed. This is the most significant reason why he has been declared largely irrelevant today. It is difficult, indeed nearly impossible, to live a life modeled after Gandhiji. He is right, of course, that overconsumption, the reality or goal of nearly every one of the 7.5 billion people in the world, is destructive to both the environment and the soul. We all realize this, but cannot or will not stop. In his sparseness, his ideals, and living within emotional needs, Gandhiji became an exemplar throughout the world, even to those who despised him. Was a hesitant public speaker. Yet people of all classes were drawn to him and instinctively felt him to be a leader of deeply spiritual and moral strength. Despite the widespread admiration shown him, he was a deeply humble man. He was acutely conscious of his own imperfections. He felt he was an ordinary man rather than a god or a saint. To quote him, "One great reason for the misunderstanding lies in my being considered almost a perfect man. I am painfully conscious of my imperfections, and therein lies all the strength I possess, because it is a rare thing for a man to know his own limitations." The more he realized about human fallibility, the more he tried to evolve morally and spiritually. When nothing else availed, he would seek refuge in God and yet carry on. In this, he reveals an attitude of his Pushti Marg ancestors. Mahatma Gandhi never sought a public or political office or title. He participated in politics for spiritual reasons. He explained in a speech in London in 1931, quote, "Although to all appearances my mission is political, its roots are, if I may use the term, spiritual. I claim that at least my politics are not divorced from morality, from spirituality, from religion. A man who is trying to discover and follow the will of God cannot possibly leave a single field of life untouched. I found through bitter experiences that if I wanted to do social service, I could not possibly leave politics alone." End of quote. Later he said, "The call to lead India did not come to me in the nature of a sudden realization. I prepared for it by fasting and self-discipline. My political work grew out of my spiritual preparation." Because of such statements and actions consistent with them, Gandhiji is universally accepted as an exemplary model of ethical and moral life, with a rare blending of personal and public life, the principles and practices, the immediate, the eternal. He considered life to be an integrated whole, growing from truth to truth every day in moral and spiritual status. His influence is felt far and wide, from Nelson Mandela in South Africa to Martin Luther King Jr. in the US, to peace advocates throughout the world. Indeed, the present widespread Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the US, which is the latest attempt and perhaps destined to be the most successful one to redress racial inequality in the US in the last half century, is deeply indebted to the legacies of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Gandhiji, followed by MLK, taught the modern art of peaceful resistance in the US. It must not be lost on anyone, least of all the citizens of India. Gandhiji was at his peak during the two bloodiest wars in world history, the two world wars of 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1945. It was during the ascendancy of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, three of the most bloodthirsty characters in human history, that Gandhiji was able to maintain his ahimsa and spearhead an independent India with very little bloodshed. This remains a high water mark in world history that we must never forget. For contemporary protesters, Gandhi's and King's political strategies could provide valuable lessons. The peaceful resistance they pursued was more effective than any violence could have been in exposing hard truths about injustices. From Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, in 1965 to protest injustices in voting rights is resonant with Gandhiji's nearly 400-kilometer march across Western India to the city of Dundee in Gujarat in 1930, where he collected salt illegally. He started with 78 people, but as the marchers proceeded, thousands more joined. Weeks later, his unarmed followers marched to a government salt depot where they met violent retaliation. But Gandhiji and his followers stood firm and ultimately prevailed. It was Gandhiji's moral integrity, his voice, and Dr. King's that remained the leading moral exemplars of the 20th and now the 21st centuries. As the world, including India and the US, stutters towards ethnic nationalism and polities based on the pursuit of one group's innate or historical superiority over another, and a blind rush towards unending resource consumptions, knowing full well that as a planet we're facing an unprecedented environmental catastrophe, we must remember Gandhiji as an exemplar. Leaving aside what we might rightly see as affectations unnecessary for our era, such as spending long hours at a chadka and fasting for weeks or months at a time. We must remember Gandhiji for his fearlessness in the face of majority-minority relations, for his environmental views, especially on the village level, and for his nonviolence. If India and the world are to prosper and turn back the clock on the moral and environmental degradation that typify our world and the majority-minority tensions throughout the world, it must remember Gandhiji and realize that this is possible. Thank you. Let's look at the, there might be questions, and if so, people can unmute themselves if you're muted and ask them, and I will meanwhile look over at the chats.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir. I think all of us will agree that it was really a treat to listen you, very enlightening. Now, I want to introduce Professor D.R. Purohit. Professor Purohit is former professor of scholar, culturalist, linguistic. He is currently a fellow at Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. He was founder director of Folk Art Department, HNB, Garhwal University. So he is one of the pioneer to revive and popularize the Uttarakhand culture across the globe. So over to you, sir, Professor D.R. Purohit.
Thank you, Professor Smith, Frederick Smith. It was a great lecture, and I can imagine how much of effort you must have put in preparing this lecture. So we are so grateful to you for coming to our university and presenting your views and your ideas on Gandhi. You have categorized, or I should say, you have divided your presentation into Gandhiji's life and meaning, and then his views on ecology and environment, and then Gandhi as a public intellectual. It was great to listen to you that how Gandhiji's life, you didn't say much about his life and style, his meaning, but you talked a lot about his economic philosophy and his environmental philosophy. So you also cited an example from our region, from the Himalayan region, Chipko movement, and we still have two great Gandhians living in the Himalaya, Sundarlal Boguna and Chandi Prasad Bhatt.
Correct.
And you talked about the greed and need of the human beings, and you also talked about Charkha and his antipathy for this urbanization, his influence on United States, Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela, and many others. And you also referred to the recent movement in America, I Cannot Breathe. That was also, of course, Gandhian. But I think we should also include in this list the great Uttarakhand movement of 1994 and 95. It was one of the very powerful Gandhian movements of this country, where without any violence, we secured to get car for ourselves a new state called Uttarakhand state. I think most of the listeners are very good scholars and they must have understood what you have said. Now the floor is open for the listeners, for the participants to ask you questions. I think I will unmute my microphone and then they can ask straight away their questions facing you yourself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Anybody has questions, they're entitled to ask, and it is always a great joy for me to be with the person who is, I always tell everybody, is the most fun person I've ever known in almost 20 years in India, Dr. Purohit. So, any questions? Okay.
Purohit ji, namaskar. Ram Bhatt from Hamburg, Germany. Namaskar. Finally, I could get in. I could log in. Unfortunately, I couldn't get in.
Professor Bhatt is from Hamburg University, Germany.
Ah, great.
Wonderful to hear you, Professor Smith. Just maybe a small question. How is Gandhi perceived today in Western world, or especially in America?
Yes, that's a good question. America, like somebody, is my. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, yes, I'm
okay. Yes. Yes, Gandhiji is revered, but he, like, one of the features of modern culture is that anything more than 15 minutes old is considered antiquated, antique, or more than 5 years old is not even studied anymore. Gandhiji is, of course, mentioned and studied in the in world history, and his ideas are quite well known, and he is viewed very favorably. He's certainly viewed as one of the leading, figures in the advancement of humanity throughout the world. There's no question about that. But unfortunately, outside of his influence on Martin Luther King and a few others, he's considered a unique and distinctly Indian figure with greater relevance to India than to any place else in the world, which is, of course, both true and untrue. I mean, of course, he did lead India's independence movement, but because of his views, he is equally relevant everywhere in the world. And I think every professor in every university is aware of this, and most students, I think, come to know this. Probably, as you know, that because you've been in Germany for quite some time, probably 10 or 15 years by now, yeah.
Yes.
You probably are aware that that's pretty much the same situation in Germany.
Yes, sir. I was just wondering in regard today's, these movements going on, especially Black Lives Matters. Is there
Yes.
something, where people are drawing their inspiration from Gandhiji or Martin Luther King?
Yeah, well, they're actively, those two names are cited quite frequently, as a matter of fact, by the Black Lives Matter leaders. I mean, they're actively trying to do this. In fact, one thing which just happened last week is that the federal government in the U.S. sent in federal troops, which has never been done before, in a show of power, in order to basically put down peaceful protesters. That failed as the federal troops moved Portland, Oregon, and in a show of basically the victory of nonviolent protests over the power of the violence of the state. So it can be done today, but it has to be done carefully. If you try to meet government violence with violence of your own, it's not going to work. It has to be met with nonviolence, as they did last week. So
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Please, anyone else?
Yeah, if no one is saying anything, then I would. It's not a question; it's just a comment. Actually,
more
Professor Smith also talked about movement, and then
Yes.
Professor Rohit also said about Uttarakhand movement.
Yes.
The Chipko movement was called as environmental movement, and afterwards it was converted into ecofeminism.
Right.
And the women who started this movement, they did not know anything about ecofeminism
Yeah.
or environment.
Right.
You said about Gandhiji, right? So
Correct.
these women, they just did that act at the spur of the moment, and they adopted the Gandhian strategy of satyagraha.
Mm.
They just hugged the trees so that the trees could not be cut by the for commercial felling, and they just said that if you have to cut the trees, you have to cut our bodies first. The women, they did not know what was feminism, what was ecofeminism, what was environmentalism, but I think they just knew that by this kind of satyagraha they can save their trees. So that was the, I think, a Gandhian principle which was applied in practice, and it got successful. It was successful. The other example which was given by Professor Purohit about Uttarakhand movement, although it was started in a different tone, but later on it was taken over by the women. And these women, they also do not know anything about the repercussions or of their own state or anything like that, but that they just wanted that there should be something for their children, for the future generation, and some kind of assurance that they would be safe. They would be having something to look forward, or to safeguard their future generations. That's how they were involved in that movement. And it was again said that the women were the harbinger of that movement, and it was true also. But my point is that it was without knowing any ideas, any principles, they worked. Just like Gandhiji got many inspirations from various experiences which he underwent during his various visits to foreign countries like South Africa and other countries, and then his experiences were replicated in practice while he observed ahimsa, satyagraha, or non-violence, or various kind of movements. You also talked about Gandhiji's economics, and you said that Gandhiji had various economic ideas, but I think his basic idea was to prepare the villagers, to prepare the common man, to prepare the rural population for their employment, their income generation. That's how he popularized charkha, because charkha has now become an indicator of was no concept of ecology or environment. These are very late concept. In 1980s and 85, when the Brundtland Commission report came into practice, then we started our talk about sustainable development, and that's how it became a very fashionable word, a fashionable thing to say that everything has to be sustainable. But Gandhiji already thought about this thing, that he said that we have to save something for future generations. That's how he talked about that there is enough for everyone in this earth, but we should not be greedy, we should not exploit it. So but your talk was very interesting, and you never allowed us to think that you are not a specialist on Gandhi. You talk like as if you are a specialist on Gandhi, not on classical or classical or Indian religions. You gave an idea that you are a specialist on Gandhiji. With the passion you talked about Gandhiji's idea, with the conviction you talked about Gandhiji's the categories on which you talked, like you talked about non-violence, you talked about environmental ideas, you talked about public intellectuals, and you quoted so many public intellectuals from Bhiku Parekh to Appadurai to Vandana Shiva, so many that I also thought that you are not a classical Sanskrit and classical Indian religious scholar, but you are a true Gandhian scholar. So I really salute you, and I really appreciate whatever you said. But the comments which I made was just to clarify that there still is a confusion that what is Gandhian and what is not Gandhian. So that's how Gandhi is relevant. That at least we are thinking about it. At least we are discussing about the Gandhian thoughts. And like since Dr. Ram Prasad Bhatt is also here, there was a lecture on Sahitya mein Gandhi. So everywhere we are trying to locate and to relocate Gandhi. We are trying to invent and reinvent Gandhi. When we want to reinvent, it means the idea is quite relevant. So thank you, Professor Frederick Smith, for your brilliant lecture, excellent lecture. And we look forward towards more such lectures. And thanks to Professor Purohit also for organizing this very valuable lecture today. And I don't know why people are not asking questions. I was expecting a volley of questions.
There is a question from Subrata Roy.
Sure. I'll just
Subrata Roy wants to ask you a question. I don't know what is the question. Question is about North America, Gandhi's influence on North America. How he says, is it appropriate to ask you about the influence of Gandhiji in the North America? How do you address the legacy of Gandhiji?
How do we judge the legacy of Gandhi? But before I answer that question, I must thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Annapurna Notial, for her wonderful and very astute and relevant comments to my talk. I mean, she's a wonderful asset for you all in Garhwal. You must hold on to her for all of your benefit. I mean, it's rare to have a vice chancellor with that degree of articulation and true concern for the area. And even seeing Purohitji here and with Professor Nautiyal, it makes me very homesick for Garhwal. As for Subrata Roy's question, how is Gandhi relevant in the U.S.? The fact that, I mean...
this is not Subrata Roy, it is Manuel from Bangladesh.
Acha, Manuel from Bangladesh. Okay. Right. Oh, here it is. Is it appropriate to ask you about the influence of Gandhiji in North America? How do you assess the legacy of Gandhiji? Gandhiji will have an unending legacy in the West and in the rest of the world. As I stated in my talk, he stood out as the singular figure in a time of among the greatest violence in the history of planet Earth. And he never diverged from his principles of ahimsa and satyagraha in the face of Hitler, Mao, British colonialism. Everything that we can imagine is thrown at a person violently, and he stuck to it. And this is remembered. This is the legacy that still is considered important about Gandhi in the West. It's very difficult for people outside of India to imagine such things as sitting at a charka or the Gandhi ashrams that you find in various parts of of North India, some places which I have visited. It's people really, except for tiny local communities scattered throughout the world, there is very little interest in returning to that kind of what they call salt of the earth methodologies of raising one's own food, making one's own clothes. This kind of thing is probably gone forever. And we're glad that there's a few pockets of it left in India. But Gandhi's legacy really resides in his sense of swachhata for the villages, the kind of self-reliant cleanliness, self-reliant personal habits of purity, of ahimsa and satyagraha. And of course, even if the people participating in the Black Lives Matter protests throughout the US, buy their food from outside and buy their clothes from stores and malls, nevertheless, they do look, and they're very conscious of the legacy of Gandhiji as being behind their actions and their attitudes towards dealing with government-sponsored violence. That's the short answer. I could go on for a long time, but that's part of the legacy, yeah.
There seems to be one more question from Professor Vinod Nautiyal, who wants to resolve a riddle that if Black Lives Matters is a movement, parallel to it is running another movement that is All Life Matters. How do we resolve?
Yes, I've read about this. one appreciates the sense that all life matters, and everybody who is participating in Black Lives Matter understands that they must appreciate that all life matters. To some extent, I need to say, however, that this term all life matters is being used by certain political forces to counter the sense that Black Lives Matter. And the reason is because everybody in the US and probably throughout the world knows that after the official end of slavery on January 1st, 1863, declared by Abraham Lincoln, that it persisted, that segregation persisted, and even though there was not formal slavery, African Americans were forced into near slave conditions for more than 100 years until Martin Luther King and others raised their awareness in great measure thanks to Gandhiji. And then over the last 20 years or 30 years, perhaps, there has been kind of a backsliding into much more oppression of African Americans. Again, this is what I was talking about at the beginning, that the majoritarian impact was to further oppress the minorities. And this is really unnecessary today, especially in an economically advanced country like the US, where there really ought to be greater availability of resources to everyone, regardless of what their race or economic status, class, and so on could be. So the question of all lives matter, yes, of course, all lives matter, but that term is being used by some people to blunt the effects of Black Lives Matter. Anyway, that's a brief answer.
Thank you, Professor. Let me tell participants that Professor Frederick Smith has been a Fulbright scholar in the Department of English, HNB Garhwal University, for 1 year. It was 2016 or 2017?
2015-16.
So 15-16. And we have been yes, Professor Frederick Smith and me have been working together on a folk Mahabharata of Garhwal.
Yes, this is great honor.
Yes. Now Sweta Verma, Dr. Sweta Verma will ask questions on behalf of all the participants. Yes, Sweta, please.
Oh, Sweta, okay.
Thank you so much, sir. There is one question from participant. As on Gandhiji's views on nature has enough to satisfy one's need, but not to satisfy one's greed. So could you please enlighten us how the Gandhian non-violence policy or satyagraha was used to protect the environment?
Yes, as Gandhiji stated often, that non-violence does not simply mean an act of not physical violence, but of using only what you need. There's no need to do violence to the earth when we can get what we need by doing minimal violence, such as harvesting rice, for example. We're doing violence to a rice plant when we kill it in order to eat its seeds. And but we can see the effect of a population that in India has gone from 300 million in 1928, which is what it was, I guess, to 1,300,000,000 today, where there is a crowding of spaces. We all know from being in India that there are certain aspects of India where we simply have not adjusted to the overcrowding. For example, what I say a lot is just go to ISBT in Delhi at midday and see how easy it is to get a bus ticket. This is a big thing, is that there is no, we can wait in line for our bus ticket, but because of this huge population explosion, there's been an enormous crush on resources, from bus tickets to food supplies. So there's been a lot more hoarding on both industrial and personal levels. And personal levels means those who have more will hoard more and deprive those who have less of what should be their own, of what they actually should be receiving. This is the case not just in India, but everywhere else in the world. So the planet, India, US, everywhere, has not adjusted to this population crisis and the effect that this has on resources and distribution of resources. So I would simply say that Gandhiji's, that we need to remember that Gandhiji has said that, I mean, imagine in 1928 what it means to only consume what's necessary, and with a population today that's about 4 or 5 times larger, how much more important it would be to remember what he said. I mean, we can go to a mall in the middle of Chicago or in the middle of Delhi. We can go to GK1, for example, and have barely no idea of what's going on in villages in Vidarbha or in Andhra Pradesh, and have no idea. We don't think about it. We don't know. We're in our own worlds of not just consumption, but of overconsumption. And in this way, it would really do us well to remember Gandhiji's life and words. I could go on at length, but I think you get the idea.
So thank you so much, Professor. I think most of the relevant questions and the crux of questions has already been asked by our learned Vice Chancellor, Professor Nautiyal. She has also summarized what all you have said during your lecture. But now I don't know how much of the time we still have at our disposal. Prashant Kandari will tell us.
So sorry to interrupt you. There is one question from Facebook.
Okay.
There is a question from Facebook that is,
Shweta,
what type of Gandhian? Yes, ma'am.
Shweta, that should be the
Yes.
last question now, because we are running over the
Sure.
time.
Yeah.
Definitely. Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am.
The last
We will take this question as a last question.
I would just like to speak, I would just make one request to Professor Smith, and after that you can wind up the program. Okay?
Okay.
This is the last question.
Okay. So this is I will consider this question as the last question. So the question is, what type of Gandhian mode you will suggest us?
What kind of, again?
Gandhian mode you will suggest us. And this question is asked by Pradeep Bhatt.
Gotcha. Okay. What kind of Gandhian mood would I suggest? I would say that a mood of security in knowing that if we behave in a morally upright and nonviolent manner, that our needs will be met in a much more full manner than if we were to put up violence. Violence breeds violence, and peacefulness breeds peacefulness. That, I think, would be a mood that should be recommended. That's my one sentence answer.
No, thank you so much, Professor. Now, Professor Annapurna Nautiyal, our learned Vice Chancellor, she will say something, and we'll wind up the debate.
So
Yes.
actually, the job of winding it up is others' job, but I would just like to make a request and as we have planned that as we are the part of the 150th birth anniversary celebration of Mahatma Gandhi, so I think as a tribute, we would like to bring out all the lectures, all the talks of the webinar in a book form. So I would like to request Professor Smith also to kindly send his very valuable thoughts to us so that we can make it a part of that proceeding. I don't know how far it will be possible for you, but it will be our request to please send your thoughts to us so that we can produce it as a proceeding in a book form. That's what I wanted to request you. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Thank you so much, Professor Frederick Smith. It is so nice to see you here.
Yes, it is my great privilege.
It's more than a year and a half I haven't seen your face.
Yes, it is.
I'm very much thankful to our learned Vice Chancellor that you were invited and you spoke. Now, Prashant, Professor Vinod Nautiyal is there on the screen. Namaskar, sir.
It's always pleased to see you, and I'm very happy to be online, with you and Professor Frederick Smith, Although I have not seen you, I think, for the last 1.5 years.
Yes.
So nice to see you and Professor Frederick. This is Professor Vinod Nautiyal.
Yes.
Indeed, pleasure to listen to your lecture, I'm very
So before ending the program, I would like to invite my colleague Dr. Shweta to present the formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Dr.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Naresh. First of all, I, Dr. Shweta Verma, extend my warm thanks to all for taking time out and being here in this today's evening. I would like to, first of all, I would like to thanks Honorable Vice Chancellor, HNB Garhwal University, Professor Annapurna Nautiyal, other Professor D.R. Purohit, moderator of the session, guest speaker of the session, Professor Frederick Smith, other senior faculty members of HNB Garhwal Universities, principals and teachers of affiliated colleges, distinguished dignitaries, research scholars, and dear participants from HNB Garhwal University. So it's my immense pleasure to propose a vote of thanks on this special lecture on representation of Gandhis in India and the West, with the lecture delivered by Professor, a very discursive and very dynamic lecture, a commendable lecture delivered by Professor Frederick Smith. We are deeply indebted to our guest speaker for sharing his ideas, and we forward to comprehend Gandhian ideas and philosophy. Today's talk is a testimony to the splendid efforts, and accordingly, it's my privilege to thank Professor Smith for delivering such an informative, insightful, and thoughtful theme. Apart from this, I would also like to say that it also helps in encouraging our scholars, academicians, students, and those interested in Gandhian thoughts and philosophy to understand the global acceptance of Gandhian principles and ideology. I take this opportunity to express my profuse gratitude and sincere thanks to Honorable Vice Chancellor, HNB Garhwal University, Professor Annapurna Nautiyal, for her esteemed presence amongst us for presiding over the session. Other than that, the valuable thoughts that ma'am has delivered, addressed on this session will no doubt serve our university in a very good stance. Thank you so much, ma'am, for once again for your encouraging words and sagacious advice and guidance. Thank you, ma'am. On behalf of our organizing committee and on behalf of HNB Garhwal University, I once again convey our gratitude and heartfelt thanks to Professor D.R. Purohit, the moderator of the session, for accepting our invitations and for sparing your valuable time and for your gracious presence, sir. I also extend my thanks for giving our session such a mediator start and end. Thank you for being with us. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Ram Prasad Bhatt from Heidelberg University, Germany, for joining us for this special lecture session. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Other than that, our special thanks also goes to our organizing committee coordinator, Dr. Prashant Khandari, Our team supports for providing the much required guidance in organizing this particular special lecture. And other than that, our team members, Dr. Nagendra Rawat, Dr. Rakesh Negi, Dr. Naresh Kumar for his team support and in finalizing the operational aspects of this special lecture discussion. Our kinds and appreciation also goes to all the distinguished dignitaries, senior faculty members of HNB Garhwal University who has spared their valuable time to be with us in this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I would also like to give my sincere thanks to faculty members of various colleges affiliated from the university and all our esteemed guests, students, research scholars, participants for joining us and for paying rapt attention to this program to make this lecture more interactive and successful end. Finally, I solicit our continued support and encouragement to march forward in a quest for knowledge. Thank you once again for all of you for joining us in this evening. And a very refreshing morning to Professor Frederick Smith once again for being with us. Thank you so much, sir. Now, with the permission of our chairman, I formally declare the end of this session.
Yeah, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.